About time to get started, for the beer and popcorn looks about exhausted. The room is almost full, if not full, and we are in for an exciting treat. I'm Phillip Sharp. I have the opportunity to introduce this evening, and I suspect that came because I'm associated with Stand Up to Cancer. I have been the chair of the Scientific Advisory Board for Stand Up to Cancer since it started. And in doing so, with a number of other scientists, we have selected the dream teams that have been supported by Stand Up to Cancer over the last 8 years. And it's been a wonderful experience. Stand Up to Cancer was started by Laura Siskin and Sherry Lansing and about 5 other women in Hollywood who wanted to have as direct and immediate impact on cancer as they could. And they then got the networks to commit to a telethon, carried on all the major networks for 1 hour in September. I think it was about 6 years ago, which had been about 2007, 2008. Laura Siskin, you will recall, is a producer who produced, among other very well-known films, Pretty Woman, Spider-Man, and The Accidental Hero. When Stand Up to Cancer started, Laura Siskin had breast cancer and was under treatment for breast cancer. And she clearly was very passionate about bringing science to patients as quickly as possible. And during the process over the last 6 years, as Stand Up to Cancer has progressed, Laura Siskin has died of breast cancer. And when she first read this book, The Emperor of All Maladies, by Sid Muji, she immediately called him and said, "You're going to win a Pulitzer for the book," which he did. "And I want to buy the rights to the book to produce a film about it." And Stand Up to Cancer has carried through with that wish. And the other leader of Stand Up to Cancer was Sherry Lansing, who's the CEO of 20th Century Fox, is a magnificent leader. She's now spending much of her time leading educational institutions and cancer research institutions around the country. So Laura Siskin then, with Stand Up to Cancer, raised the funds, contacted Ken Burns to produce the documentary around the book, The Emperor of All Maladies. Now, Sid Muji, who's the author of the book, was trained at Stanford and then went to Oxford and got his PhD, and then came back to Harvard Medical School and did his MD at Harvard. When I met him about a year ago, he came up and introduced himself as my grandson. And I didn't understand what he meant by that. But what he meant by that is that when he went off to Oxford, he got his PhD. And when he came back to Harvard Medical School, he was to be supported in the MD PhD program. And because he already had a PhD, he couldn't get supported by that program. So during the 4 years he was at Harvard in his MD program, he was being paid as a postdoc by Connie Sepko, who got her PhD in my lab many years ago. So this book, if you haven't read it, is really worth reading. It's a wonderfully written book, and if you enjoy the film, you'll love the book. So the series will be on the air tonight in PBS at 9 to 11, and due to the work of Anna and others here at the Koch, we have been able to get this early preview. What will happen this evening is we'll have the first hour, and then we'll have a break, and we have a treat at the break that Jack Youngelson, who was the director of this first session is with us, and we'll have a panel which will be moderated by Tyler Jacks, and there will be others on the panel that Tyler will introduce. I don't want to take time to do that now. I do want to remind you to tweet away. One of the reasons that I really wanted this session is I wanted to get as much buzz about this PBS series as I could get. So tweet away. There's a cumulative $100 prize, but there's a $50 prize for whoever gets the most answers to their tweets, and then the second and third. And so I look forward to seeing those numbers. I just have no idea how many answers or responses to tweets there will be, but tweet away. So with that, I think we're scheduled to do the first hour of the documentary, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you.
Plan was to pause the film at roughly the halfway point. You're all thinking to yourself, please don't pause that film. I totally understand, but we decided based on a variety of factors that we would take a pause now and have a discussion about what you've just seen, and then return to the film for those of you who can stay after that discussion. So we'll have this discussion for the next 45 minutes or so. So please hang in there, and there will be opportunities for you to ask questions and participate directly in that discussion. The way we're going to start is with a very special guest, who's Jack Youngelson, who directed this first episode of this series. And we're incredibly grateful to Jack for taking the time to be with us today and share in this experience, this really wonderful experience. Jack is a documentary filmmaker. He's a writer and producer and director. He's produced and directed a number of outstanding documentary films that run the gambit from the world's oceans to atrocities in Abu Ghraib, for which he won an Emmy Award, actually. And he's produced films for HBO and Netflix and the BBC, among others. So he's a very accomplished filmmaker, and I think you'll agree with me that he has really masterfully captured the complexities of the cancer story, weaving together the human side of cancer, but also bringing together the history and the science and the will to do a better job. So we're very, very grateful to you, Jack, for what you've done here and also for you being with us today. So we're going to hear from Jack. We'll give you his perspectives for a little bit, and when Jack is done, I'm going to invite up a panel of individuals who will also share their perspectives. Jack.
Hi, thank you everyone for coming. It's a real treat, and thanks to the Koch Institute, to Stand Up to Cancer, and also my colleagues Ken Burns and Barak Goodman, who also directed this episode, who I wish could be here to share this with you. It's it's, for me, when I say it's a rare treat, tonight hopefully many people will tune in and watch on television, but to see it in a room filled with interested and engaged people who actually follow this and are probably the harshest critics. It's like going to serve up a meal to the best cooks in the world, and hopefully you don't fail them. So it's and that's what makes it special, and also to be able to share and engage in the talk that we'll have afterwards. So I'll try to be brief, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about, in thinking about the storytelling, what we're engaged in. So much of the book and so much of this narrative is about how the past informs the present and how the present continues to inform the future of cancer care. And our task in conceiving of the series was really monumental, like how to fold all of this history into 6 hours of television. And from my end of things, it was, let's begin with that papyrus and go to the war on cancer in 1970. And that's 2 hours to do all of that. In the world of PBS, that's, I think, 1 hour, 56 minutes and 15 seconds, if we're going to be exact. And I think that, we had this remarkable guide and template for how to do that. And that was Sid Arta Mukherjee's book, because no one else had ever really tried to encapsulate and tackle this and really look holistically across all of the various strands of what we know when we talk about cancer and understanding its treatment and understanding the disease or diseases itself. And it's a rare book. It's a rare book in so many ways. I mean, I think of other projects I've worked on. We were talking about this a little bit before. I worked on a project about energy and how we power the nation, for example, and another project for PBS. And there were books on coal, and there were books on wind farms, and there were books on nuclear power. No one had ever really put it all together. And I think in the case of this book, that's what makes it really so special. And from people within the field who favor certain ideas, and there might be quibbles on the detail level about what's contained there, but overall, I think it's incredibly ambitious and incredibly rewarding experience for anyone who hasn't read it. I really encourage you to read it because it's only, we can only do so much in the time that we have here. I also was thinking too a bit about the book in terms of the way, first of all, that the series has been presented and what the book involves. And it's been called a biography of cancer. It's been called a biography of cancer. But I was thinking if I was going to go to a bookstore and look for this book and look for where it would sit in the realm of biography and literature and art and science, I'd actually look in the mystery section. Because I think that this story that we're telling here is really about how do you crack that mystery? And how do you deal with the trapdoors and the false leads and those impregnable moments that are also lifted by moments of great discovery. And I think that that's kind of where I think it sits. I think it's a mystery and not full-on biography. I think that the other real strength of the book, and hopefully what we tried to capture here, is that the story is not just one of great researchers and great physicians, but it's also about elevating the stories of patients. And so in the telling of it, that's one thing that we were super, super engaged in, super, super focused on, that these names you might know, Sidney Farber and Vesalius and all the other big thinkers who are represented here, but it's the Robert Sandler and it's Karen Lord, who we'll meet later, and Einar Gustafsson, names that you wouldn't know that Sid remarkably elevated and brought to a different place. And I think in that balance, that's where was the sweet spot for us in really telling the story. In the same way, we wanted to be able to toggle back and forth between the historical and the present day. And as you can see in the structuring of the film, we are bouncing back and forth between contemporary stories of the treatment of childhood leukemia and the original story of Sidney Farber as kind of a spine, at least for this first half, of how the disease was treated and looked at. And it's such a remarkable 70 years, the way I see it. I mean, coming into this project, understanding just how chemotherapy is part of the vernacular when we talk about, so much part of the vernacular when we talk about cancer treatment. But to really see and understand and grasp that it was so novel and so unique and such a risk and shot in the dark when that process began, and Sidney Farber went down that path. In the same sense, today, in following these modern cancer care stories, we're extremely lucky that institutions like Johns Hopkins, the NCI, the Charleston Area Medical Center in West Virginia all opened their doors to us because it really, they allowed us into a period in the lives of their patients and of their treatment that was ongoing, that was extremely sensitive and incredibly raw. And so it was a real honor to be, allowed to do that. And I think, that in those parallels that we found and that we discovered between the young patients who were in the hospital at Hopkins and that we followed, that the parallels with what we saw prior in reaching back into the history of Farber started to really come together. For us, it was about a 2.5-year journey really of assembling that film. So we couldn't really know where those stories would go or where they would land. But we did know that childhood leukemia, for example, has an 80% survival rate today. And for the age and era of Sidney Farber, it was a death sentence. So that loop And that closing of the loop is, I think, what the series and its ambition intends to do, to really show that, as I said before, coming back to the idea of how does the past inform the present and the present inform the future. I think that you'll see that throughout the series, and you'll understand when you talk about Rouse sarcoma, and we talked about Weinberg, we talked about oncogenes, and just the experience of how research that was done in stops and starts, abandoned, returned to, reappraised, reassessed. It's a remarkable mystery story, and one that ultimately finds its way. And I think that's what the series hopes to do. And I think it's also just, in a sense, the film is only part of it. It's part of a broader conversation that we hope to engage in, and continuing kind of focus and accessibility in terms of how we talk about cancer and how we look at it and how we understand it. So I hope it can stimulate that, and thank you so much for being here.
Okay, Jack, we're going to let you stay up here, and we're going to invite some other guests, including Bob Weinberg and Phil Sharp, Linnea Duff, and hopefully Kim Stegmeyer, who's sitting right over here. So if you guys could come up, we need a fifth chair. There are five, I see that. Phil Sharp's trying to beg off coming up, and I'm not going to let him. So I'll introduce my colleagues. I think everybody here knows Bob Weinberg, whose work in cancer genetics has helped define the field, and cancer biology has played an important role, a critically important role in bringing us to where we are today on our understanding about cancer. I've told you about Jack Youngelson already. I didn't mention that he's a Princeton undergrad. We won't hold that against him. English major there, and parlayed that into a writing career and then a documentary film career. Phil Sharp, Nobel laureate, whose work likewise has taught us a tremendous amount about how cells function, genes are expressed, and the genome is organized, continues to contribute mightily to this day. Linnea Duff, sitting to Phil's right, is hopefully familiar to many of you. Linnea is really a part of our community. She's visited us many times. She's a lung cancer survivor, was diagnosed with advanced lung cancer 10 years ago. And over the course of her treatment was treated by our own Alice Shaw. And I should mention that Alice will appear in a future episode of this series, and as will Bob Weinberg. Linnea has been very outspoken about her own experiences with therapy and improvements of therapy and how one deals with cancer. I'm also pleased to say that Linnea's son, Peter, who was 7 when she was diagnosed, is now 18, and he'll be working in the Koch Institute this summer and has ambitions of being a cancer researcher, so that's wonderful. And Kim Stegmeyer is a physician, scientist at the Dana-Farber. She was trained at Duke and then at Harvard Medical School, continued her medical training in this community, and Kim does a lot of different things in the laboratory and in the clinic, trying to understand the basis of leukemia, but also treats pediatric cases of leukemia as well as other pediatric diseases. And so her perspective on the stories that we've just been hearing, I think, are particularly helpful. So thank you for being here. Cancer is really the tie that binds us all together. We all understand the disease at the many levels that were presented in the film so far. And we thought it would be important to have a discussion, take this opportunity to have a discussion, one that will start today and hopefully will continue on well into the future. And we've invited this particular group of people to weigh in on that because they do represent very important and very distinct perspectives: the scientists, the physician, the patient and survivor, the filmmaker. And I'm very curious to hear, in their words, how they reacted to what they just heard. And that will be the start of this discussion that we're having. I might ask just that one question. We'll see how it goes. We'll see how well they do. But I have other questions in case they falter. And before the time is up, we will reserve time for you guys to ask questions as well, and I'm sure that you will have some. So I guess I'll ask my question from here, and then maybe I can get some help. Are they going to be heard from those microphones from where they're? Yeah, so maybe somebody can help move them around. So I'm going to ask the perspectives question, as I alluded to already, the perspective of scientist, physician, patient, survivor, and filmmaker about what you've seen. You know, from this story that you've just heard is a wonderful one of history and of mystery. And I'm curious from each of these people's perspectives how they view it, how they view from where we've come and where we are today. So we'll start with Bob Weinberg. He didn't know that I was going to start with him, but here he is.
I figured as much. Well, I've been doing what I'm doing now for exactly 40 years. I started across Ames Street already then, a couple of years before 1975. And now, 40 years later, I get emails every 2 or 3 weeks from somebody across the globe or across the country who says, "Doc, what can you do for me?" And I say, well, I'm not a real doctor. I'm really a PhD. And at most, I can refer them to a clinician like Kim Stegmeyer over there. But in the end, although I've worked for 40 years with the faith that if we know more about the causative forces that create cancer, we'll be able to treat it better, it's still largely a matter of faith. That is to say, I continue to work, and I trust the people in my group continue to work, with the faith that what we're learning will one day accrue to the benefit of patients. And I say faith because the great majority of what I've been a part of, and other people like me in the basic cancer research field, has been intellectually fascinating, conceptually stimulating, but hasn't really accrued to the benefit of patients. And so when people ask me, "Doc, when are we going to cure cancer?" I say, well, it's not going to be one dramatic battle that we're going to win. It's going to be a series of skirmishes where we push the disease back step by step, inch by inch. Well, when are we going to cure it, Doc? And I raise my shoulders and I say, gee, I really don't know, but we just have to keep on trucking. We cannot ever give up.
I would actually push back a little bit, Bob, because it seems to me, and I think this is something important for this audience to know and believe, that although you might say that the things that you've done in your lab have not themselves directly led to the improvements in the treatment of a patient, everything that you've done has set the stage for the advances that we are now living with. And so, by analogy, if people like Virchow had not done what he did, we wouldn't understand that cells do what they do and give us the understanding of how cancer develops. And so, likewise, our understanding of cancer genes has really enabled new therapies based on our understanding of those genes. Do you disagree?
No, I can't disagree. I'm not interested in overt false modesty. At the same time, I'm uncomfortable of being compared with Virchow, who, by the way, took his idea of all cells come from cells from a guy named Robert Remak in Berlin, who, for various racial reasons, wasn't allowed to be part of the German Academy of Sciences. But that'll stay entre nous.
I'm going to skip Jack for the moment and come over to Kim Stegmeyer, who also has the perspective of the scientist, but also the perspective of the physician. So when you look at this film, how does it make you feel about where we are and where we're headed?
So I'm going to comment, as Tyler has asked me to do, on both sides of the question. So I think, the first thing that I'm going to put the physician, actually I'll put the scientist hat on first. So I think, one of the things that is so striking when you watch this first episode is the passion, is the drive, is the work ethic, is the curiosity of these early investigators, some of whom gave their life at the end of the day for this faith and belief that what they were going to do is going to have an impact on patient care. And I think that there is something so driving about the wonder of discovery. I think, and one of my colleagues likes to call it an addiction, the addiction of discovery. And I think that really does come through in this film, that there is such incredible passion in us about our research and our work. And I think for somebody who also then provides clinical care, that's coupled with an absolute urgency that you see these children, you see the families, you see the effects of the disease, you see the effects of our treatment, and you know that we don't have a lot of time, because for this patient, this child, this adult, the time is now. And I mean, I think for me, for someone who does both the laboratory-based work and then the care delivery and some translation in the middle, one really does feed into the other. That, when you're having a bad day in the lab, you remember the patient, you remember why you're actually doing what you're doing, and I don't think there's a better motivation. I think the other thing that this film captured so incredibly well is the fact that you can't make progress without taking risks. And I think that first leap of faith that you're giving a patient nitrogen mustard or you're giving a patient aminopterin, those were decisions made not without a lot of controversy. And I think as we now look forward, I'm going to use pediatrics as an example. This is an issue that we really face today. So, we're curing somewhere between 80, 85, maybe upwards of 90% of children with childhood ALL. How do you continue to make progress when you're curing around 90% of patients? So there's the questions of children who don't do well, children who have high-risk disease where you can bring novel therapies to them. But for the patients where we are curing 80, 90%, you saw that the therapies have toxicity. So there are long-term effects on cardiac health, there are effects on neurocognitive development. Radiation causes secondary malignancies. It's not just a neurocognitive effect. So how do you now take a 90% cure rate? Can you ever eliminate these poisons? And that's something we debate a lot in pediatric oncology. And the field is relatively conservative, actually, on the clinical side. So I think those of us who bridge the gap, who are in the lab, who see the patients, we are probably a little bit more aggressive in what we're willing to do and a little more comfortable with risk taking, but that is not always the wave on the clinical side. And so these are things that we discuss and talk about a lot. I think the other thing that I'm sure will, as the film moves forward, there's also now so much capability, right? Even when we think about childhood ALL, how many therapies we now have. Immunologic therapies is really obviously one of the new, very exciting areas for this disease. How do we now incorporate these therapies into our standard of care? How do we incorporate genomics? And I find that us who are also at the bench, when we have a patient who's relapsed, we're constantly looking, what's the next thing? What's the next thing? If we sequence the genome, will we find a target? Will there be a therapy? And there is that balance with that versus some of other folks who feel like, should we try that experimental therapy that's not without risk? And how do you balance, the science and cutting edge research with the clinical care delivery and safety? And, it's not easy. But I think, we all really love what we do, and we love taking care of these wonderful children. And, everyone is quite committed to trying to make those advances, but it's challenging. There are a lot of challenges in it.
I would just underscore something that Kim said that I think is incredibly important. Medicine is conservative, and we're sort of the victims of history in the sense that these treatments get built up over time. They become standard of care. Standard means that's what you, in a sense, have to do when there's tremendous opportunities for improvement. So for many of you in the room, don't assume that even for the cancers for which we treat patients effectively, there wouldn't be room for better, because in almost every case there is. I want to turn to Phil Sharp, who's also an old hand at this game. And I'm interested really in your perspective, Phil, broadly, including as, I'm going to say, the basic scientist, the contributions of the basic scientist to, again, laying the groundwork for where we are. But you can take it anywhere you want.
Well, I think the basic scientist and the role I played is to sort of advance our knowledge of cells and genes and how they work, and collaborate with people like Bob here to the left and Tyler and others in trying to push my knowledge into systems more directly applicable to understanding the disease of cancer. But I want to turn the question a little different to the film, since I have Jack sitting to my left. This film opens with a very emotional impact. I mean, it really does, at least to someone like myself who doesn't deal day to day with patients. Seeing these young patients struggle and their parents struggle with the disease, hearing these stories of the real toll of this disease, and it's real, but it's really a very emotional opening to the story of the history of cancer. And it required you to be directly in the room and with people who are really articulate and able to show emotion and be comfortable being filmed. How, as a director, do you deal with that? I mean, how does that happen? And why did you make the decision to open with such an emotional, direct impact on the audience?
Let me just say that I'm the MC here, but
Thank you. So I think that, that as I said earlier, it is the stories of the patients that is critical to find that balance. And we didn't want to just dip right into the history. We didn't want to begin the film in a place that felt ossified. We wanted to put you in the room and put you in the experience of a parent with a child and what that meant and how that felt. And that question, again, that question of what's next, which is really how the film begins. So I think that was the motivation. And it's interesting, just when we talk about process, we did view it in a couple of different ways, and we viewed it without that scene, and then we watched it with that scene, and I think we came around to understanding that scene was critical. It pushes you into the moment, it brings you into the story, and it lands you there. And without it, I guess you don't really understand fully what's at stake. And that was how we arrived there. And in terms of process, at Johns Hopkins and specifically, we had a team of individuals who were there and really lived there and were part of that hospital experience. And as you can imagine, these are very, very tricky, very sensitive, vulnerable times in terms of why would a patient participate? Why would the doctors open their doors when there are so many question marks? And that team included like Allie Sargent and Deborah Dixon and people who really had great experience in understanding how to negotiate those waters. And it's also when, just in a pure filmmaking sense, when to turn the cameras off or when to realize it's best to pull back. And so those are questions that you ask yourself over and over and over again. And just, again, back to process, it's a question you ask yourself when you're piecing it together. How far do you go? We don't want the film or the stories to dip into melodrama or to become manipulated by other means, by the use of music or we wanted to strip that down. And so if you notice, like in those scenes, like we leave it pretty bare. The music plays a part in the other sections, but we just want the scenes to speak for themselves. And I think that was really where we were coming from, and our eye in terms of how to sensitively tell it.
it was incredibly powerful. And also the juxtaposition of the history, when you think of Farber treating more or less the same patient, and then so many years later, experiencing that once again. So Linnea, Jack's been just describing the perspective of those individuals in the room. You've been one of those individuals. So let's hear about your understanding of the disease from your perspective.
Well, as you were speaking, I was thinking that the reason those people probably agreed to participate is once you've been pulled into this disease, whether it's you or in their case, a family member, I think you want to be part of the solution. And as a patient, how you become part of the solution sometimes is by sharing your story. For the movie itself, for me, the major impact initially was watching those parents, just emotionally, and thinking back to my own diagnosis. And part of how I dealt with it was by saying, well, at least it's me. It's not my kids. I don't know how someone would manage that, but I can tell you that my son Pete, who was going to come work here at the lab this summer. He was only 7 when I was diagnosed, and my initial treatment was to have a lower left lobectomy. And when he came to the hospital after the surgery and saw me hooked up to all of these tubes and machines, he just crawled in my bed and made animal noises. And, you know, it broke my heart. But it was also the thing, perhaps, that provided the greatest motivation for me to go through whatever I needed to go through to try to stay alive. And risk-taking was mentioned as well. And I think you should never underestimate what risk takers we patients are. We really, really want to live, and we will do just about anything to live. And I was told back in 2008 that I had a few months to live, and I became the 4th participant in the world to try crizotinib, with non-small cell lung cancer. And 3 phase 1 clinical trials later, I'm still alive. And also what you said about not sure about the progress that's been made, again, never underestimate how grateful we all are, and that for us, we see huge progress. And to be able to stay alive a few months more means that there might be a chance for another therapy that will give us another few months, et cetera, et cetera. And I will never be cured, probably. And I don't actually refer to myself as a survivor. I say I'm surviving, and I'm very content to be surviving.
Thanks, Linnea. So I'm going to turn it open to the audience in 1 second, but I want to ask whoever wants to answer. There's another theme. Take that if you would. There's another theme that's recurrent in the film up to this point, and that is the goal to reach a solution, the magic bullet. There will be a cure, and yet time and time again we realize how challenging that is. And I was struck by the headlines that you showed. 1901. Cure for cancer. 1947, dramatic improvements. And we could say the same about 2014. So in that perspective, versus the expectations that the community, the world might have, what should we be telling them about the reality?
I think there's a real question as to whether we have done the world a service or a disservice by overpromising that the cancer would be cured in our lifetimes, that it would be cured over the next decade, when many of us who were making those promises knew that that, in fact, was an unrealistic promise, and that we were just acting as cheerleaders for our own community rather than accurate purveyors of the truth. And the question is now, when should we start reining in our forecasts, or the forecasts of the American Cancer Society, which has all of these Pollyanna projections for how much progress we're making? When is the time come to be a little more realistic without attempting at the same time to cripple our ability to function as basic researchers and gain the funds that are required to push the research further?
Phil.
I think the real issue is there's really been very significant advances, and one of the most exciting advances in decades in therapy is the new immunotherapy. And there are some very striking results that have in melanoma and as well in lung cancer that we've seen with those therapies. And that's a whole new spectrum that isn't so mutationally dependent, but is using the immune system of the body. But you're talking about overselling. Last night on 60 Minutes, I don't know if anybody saw 60 Minutes last night, they showed a phase 1 clinical trial at Duke where they were injecting poliovirus into the lesions in the brain, glioblastoma, and talking about some really miraculous, first 2 patients. I've been out 3 years for that disease. It's remarkable. But I was really torn by, I'm excited about the possibility that there could be a treatment for this disease. It's a death sentence, and I've lost many friends to it. And yet the promise of this new therapy to desperate people who may have expectations that are not realistic. And for a phase 1 early clinical trial, it's remarkable that 60 Minutes picked that as a lead program.
I think that there's a sort of latent desire to believe that there will be one, and that's what I was referring to. It's been true for 100 years or more. And just coming back to what you said in response to Bob, I agree with you that we cannot deny the progress that has been made in the more effective treatment of many different cancers, childhood leukemias, adult lung cancer. Patients are treated differently now, and they're surviving differently now, thanks to the work that's been done by scientists and physicians for the last 40 or 50 years. So let me ask whether the audience has questions of their own for any members of our panel or groups of them. We have microphones. There's a brave soul.
So I guess this is just directed more at the director. I'm kind of curious whether what inspired you to take on directing this particular documentary. Do you have a personal connection, or is it just an actual intellectual interest or job offer?
Wow. Well, I mean, I think we all have an invested interest in cancer in some way or the other. Everyone's touched, and I certainly have been with family and friends, so that's clearly there. I mean, I was, from the very beginning, when I talked to Barak and I talked to the team about being involved in this, I was actually really, really thrilled to be part of this episode of the early history, because as you get deeper into the science and deeper into the storytelling, it becomes a different kind of animal in terms of how, and I think, as you'll stick with it, you'll see what I mean. It becomes more complex. And the questions at this point, as I said before, just are pretty simple. What do we do? What kind of poison do you throw at it? How do you cut it out? How do you burn it? And I think it's those very basic questions, without a genetic roadmap, without a deeper understanding of the design of the cancer cell, those shots in the dark are just, for me, just a fascinating story of an engagement with the science, of blind leaps of faith, of tremendous progress, and also, as I said before, also dead ends. I think another thing that was very interesting about this episode for me was these almost 3 different tracks of surgery and radiation, and using chemotherapy. And they're almost operating in different spheres. And I think, again, maybe everyone else can speak to this, but I imagine that there are parallels in terms of how do different sides of the science come together and work together and not operate in a way that's kind of on these separate tracks. And so in wrapping those ideas together was what really fascinated me. There was also a bit of an archaeology in the process for us in terms of really digging deep into the material, and there's subtle things in terms of how we used Virchow's original cell drawings, or going back to Vesalius's original material. And we wanted the experience, and as you track the film across the progression of it, we wanted you to try to understand from the scientist's point of view or perspective what they were seeing through the barrel of that microscope, or what they were doing or understanding in terms of those autopsies that they were performing. And in that kind of direct moment where you don't have an electron microscope, where you don't have all of this engineering and all of this funding and possibility that you bring to bear to kind of just unpack it. Like, how do you get there? And for me, I think that's what really piqued my interest and really pulled me into it.
More questions? I've never seen you so quiet. Anna.
I guess this is one for Kim or maybe Linnea. It's about some recent states who have passed this right to try legislature, I don't know how to say that word, and compassionate use of experimental drugs. And I think it's relevant to researchers here who work hard to find something, yet we know standard of care is often quite what's the word, conservative. So how can we move that forward to get more states to take that on, and how can we, do you have any thoughts about insurance companies, how they probably still don't cover off-label drugs, and how do we, I don't know if you think about this in your own research versus lab versus MD work, how can we as a community push that along?
So I think that it's a question with multiple layers. So I think if we look at the more political advocacy side of things, so I had the pleasure of being part of a society called the Society for Pediatric Research, which really is just that. It's advocating for the importance of research for children, childhood diseases. And one of the really interesting things that they had us do is actually go to Washington, D.C., and meet with our senators and House members to really talk about the importance of research and champion issues such as this. And I think that for those of us who are from Massachusetts, we're pretty aligned, I think, with our leadership largely on many of these issues around research. It's other states where research is less supported that we actually really need folks to go in there and talk to your political leaders. So if you guys are voting in other states, this is actually really something important to do, because I can't walk into a state that does not support research on the leadership side and make a difference. It's got to be from within the state and the voting community. So I think that's one thing. I think a second is, as we've seen with groups such as Stand Up to Cancer, that the power of collaboration and the power of backing with such a support group as Stand Up has really made a difference in access to drugs for patients and getting pharmaceuticals to work together and getting some of these experimental drugs to our patients. I think in pediatrics, this is even a bigger issue. So, as we're talking about all this amazing genomic work that's going on in our communities, when we think about the complexity of that in a child, it goes something as follows. I sequence a patient's tumor, we find a lesion. There's a drug that inhibits that target. That drug is not FDA approved, and the drug's never been given to a child. So how do I now actually do that N of 1 study in a pediatric patient? So, our community now is really uniting around collaborative clinical genomic trials. We're working hard to get systematic approaches to actually access the drugs for patients, because every N of 1, if you have to reinvent the wheel, is a nightmare. But I think largely through collaboration, through support of groups like Stand Up, and through all of us, tapping into our political leadership are some ways, some ideas.
So Linnea, address that question from the point of view. You mentioned that patients are anxious to participate.
We're very anxious to participate, but the thing that concerns me about this particular concept is who's going to pay for it. And I don't think insurance is going to cover it. So I wonder if it's going to be something that is just going to point out more the disparity in care. And having my care at MGH, I know how fortunate I am. The clinical trials I've participated in, I would have probably not had that opportunity had I been anywhere else. And knowing patients who don't have my oncologist or who live in another country or even Canada, I know how much more difficult it has been for them to have access to the same treatments that I have. And this worries me a little. I think it's a really good idea. I think most of us would love to have the right to try something. But for instance, the clinical trials I'm in, when I tell people that the pharmaceutical company that sponsors the trial pays only for the experimental drug, that everything else my insurance has to pick up or I would pay for privately, they're always very surprised. But it's expensive to participate in these.
So we have only a few minutes remaining. I'm looking out across the audience to see if there are additional questions. One here.
Thank you. My question is more philosophical, I think, and don't think there's an answer for it, but I would still like to know how you, doctor, think about it and how you, patient, think about it. But it is true that if we go to the basic definition of what being a doctor is to help others to be well, to get better, to feel well. And it is also true that, unfortunately, the treatments, although mean well, cause a lot of pain and secondary effects that are not desirable and toxic and might cause cancer even. So my question is more towards the line, where do you define the line where you are a doctor and you want to do well, but at the same time you're recommending something that could be harmful, and at the same time you have to deal with the patients and the will they have to survive and the will they have to do everything they can, even if it's something harmful. So how do you deal with this on a daily basis?
So, I mean, it's a great question, and it's a difficult one, and maybe I can try to answer it with two examples. And I'm going to get very choked up if I talk about them, but I'll try. So I think it is the dialogue with the patient and the family is really the essential key in terms of the answer to your question. And in pediatrics, it has the added challenge that it's not that you're, when I work with an adult, you're treating the adult and the adult can make the decisions. In the case of a child, it's different because you have the child, who can assent at certain ages, but it's the parents who are making decisions on behalf of the child. And so that adds just incredible complexity to decisions. But it really is, I think, this constant discussion, so I can give you a couple of examples. We're very open and honest with our families and the children, at age-appropriate level of discussion, and really try to be as honest with the information that we have about what the risks are, what the potential benefits are, and when we have an opinion, rendering an opinion. But it is that constant back and forth. So, as an example, I had a child who had a metastatic solid tumor that recurred twice, and we were at a point where we actually did not have curative therapy. And we made a decision after discussion with the family about trying another cytotoxic chemotherapy that the child had not had, talking through risks and benefits. And the child had pretty significant toxicity from it. But we had evidence that her tumor was responding. And the parents decided that they did not want to do any more therapy. And they said that the child, who was at the time 6, didn't want to do any more therapy. And as the treating physician, this was so hard for me because, one, you go to love, you're part of the family, you love this child, you love the parents, but yet that, I had to respect their decision. And it was hard because part of you is like, how much does the child participate at 6 in the decision? And we had, I made a home visit, and this child said to me, I'm gonna go to heaven before my mommy and daddy are. And we had this conversation where she said, are you gonna remember me? Are you gonna love me forever? And I really felt like this family was correct, that this child had actually come to peace in a way that she could at her age. And for that child and that family, this was the right decision. Our treatment at that point in time was not curative. In contrast to, I had another child who had also a metastatic solid tumor, and this, young man wanted every single thing we could possibly do, to the very end. And we respected that decision, and we had things that were really not causing overt harm, but were tumor directed. And for that child and that family, that was the right way to manage this very horrible situation. And I think, each situation is unique, and it's by, good communication that you can really do the best that you can, and it's imperfect. And it's more complex because it's not the direct doctor to patient in a consenting decision process. There is a child, but we try as much as we can to get some sense of what the child might want to the extent that you can, but it's not easy.
Linnea, we're going to give you the last word. You inspire us. I think you want us to do more in everything we can do. So inspire us.
Oh boy. Well, please, please, please just keep on doing what you're doing and know that we are so, so grateful. Obviously, parents of kids with cancer and all of us with cancer. And I have to segue a little bit back to what you said, although maybe it's going to take it down again. But I think that kids have sort of a grace that adults don't sometimes. I think they're more realistic than we are in a bizarre way. And the children I've known with cancer sometimes are better able to let go. And I think that I'm also going to circle back to that whole idea of cure and over-promising, that a more realistic discussion of cancer in general, I think, would be a healthy thing, to not keep throwing the word cure out there, but instead to say, hey, we're making progress, and progress is a good thing, and you can live with cancer. I've been living with cancer for 10 years now, and it's doable. So please, keep doing research.
Okay. So, please.
So I think on the ped side, we actually do cure a lot of our patients. And when I came in, I sat down, and on my phone was a message from my first patient to have a baby, who is a survivor. She is cured of her solid tumor, and she's bringing her baby up to see me tomorrow. So she was my first patient to get married, first patient to have a baby, and she represents really the years of progress to cure. And so keep working.
Well, let me actually tell you the game plan here. So I'm going to give you a few minutes to refresh and then resume the presentation of the film probably at 5 after the hour. So if you need to use the restroom, do so and resume, take your seats again. But please join me in thanking our panelists. I want to especially thank Jack Youngelson again for making the trip up to New York to be with us, but to all of our panelists, please.